All right, we're going to talk some processing, because processing is definitely a big thing. We've got a whole bunch of acreage that's going to need to get processed here coming September, October, November. And somebody else may be joining us up here. I don't know. Doug, are you still around? Or did you just leave?
I'm here, but I think I was supposed to do the automation.
Yeah, but I think that Andrew moved it out there to 2 o'clock, so.
It is 2 o'clock.
I know. Well, that's what.
Oh, right. No, they're still having drone calls.
Yeah, so.
Do you want me to fetch him or no?
No, we're going to jump into the extraction here. We can try to work that in back. Anyway, we're going to talk extraction. Sorry, we're just kind of rambling around here, but. Jeff?
I'm sorry.
So,
Perfect.
let's talk extraction.
Excellent. Did you have a question there, Morris?
No, I don't have a question.
Okay. So, Bill, could you tell us a little bit about your background, please?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bill Abbott. I run an extraction facility, a very large toll processing facility in Erie, Colorado. We do CO2. Currently, we have 16 300-liter supercritical extraction lines up and running with post-extraction. I've been in the industry out here. I rolled out here in arguably the first mobile lab ever created. We took an old Mayo Clinic mobile mammogram laboratory and put a 20-liter high-flow Eden machine in the back of it. And I've been out here and have just been welcomed into this community and been processing and growing hemp ever since.
That's amazing.
And I'm John House. I guess originally got into the industry through the marijuana side of extraction, and now based down here in Montrose, Colorado, run CO2 extraction, also adding ethanol extraction here, working towards organic certification on some of that as well.
Excellent. Could you highlight what you feel are the key differentiators between ethanol and CO2?
There's a lot of differences between ethanol and CO2. A couple years ago, I would have told you CO2 was the only way to go. The reality is that a lot of my clients are looking for bulk raw extracted crude oil. Some of that necessitates CO2. A lot of the products that are being created through extracted hemp oil don't need the CO2. Ethanol has its advantages. I guess, both extraction methods present their own challenges as well. But.
Excellent. And Bill, same question for you. Key differentiators between CO2 and ethanol?
Yeah, I think that, essentially both of these solvents are extremely effective solvents in their own right, and both do pose their own unique challenges. One of the major differentiators for me is if you're in a large-scale toll processing facility that's focused on an ethanol-based methodology, what you have to put in place to control the amount of ethanol that you have in those facilities greatly, that differentiates CO2 from ethanol right off the bat, is C1, D1 type facilities for control of the ethanol. That would be the major difference that I can see. But again, both of those solvents have been, the prettiest thing of the week, the flavor du jour. It's gone back and forth, but the major differentiator is just facilities to run those types of processes.
Thank you. If you could just introduce yourself and then answer that question, the key differentiators between ethanol and CO2.
My name is Dustin. I'm with Speedy Grow, a extraction company out of Grand Junction, and manufacturer out of Salt Lake. We mostly do finished products for private labeling for any retailer that's looking to brand their own product, or we do have brands that they could wholesale and sell into the retail market. As far as the difference, obviously CO2 has its major advantages from being a cleaner solvent, like what Bill said. The storage issue, that's a pretty big issue, because when you get into large volumes, it's a lot of alcohol that has to be stored, and so that's one of the biggest things. But alcohol is a very effective solvent. If done properly, you can remediate most of the alcohol and get the residuals down to very, very low levels. And then you can also, if you extract with it properly, you can extract a very clean product. So And it's it's a little bit easier to work with for maybe not, I want to use the word novelist, but on a larger production with minus the storage issue, it's a little easier to work with. It doesn't take as much technical skills to run. So
Excellent. Thank you, Dustin. So, since we're with you, I'm going to ask you to just answer this next question. How has processing changed since the Farm Bill was signed?
how is
in
process?
your view? Yeah.
I would say,
Processing world and extraction world.
well, I think the changes are coming more than they've happened. I think it's getting into these things when you start seeing more regulatory bodies like the FDA, and you start, instead of saying we're GMP compliant, which you just can say we're GMP compliant, you need to start becoming GMP certified. You need to have the right GMPs placed. You're gonna have to have all the proper quality controls. There's just gonna be a lot of things that have to happen that people aren't currently doing to make sure you're in compliance, and then you're protecting the public as well. And so I think those changes are coming, the big ones.
Bill, how about you?
Yeah, I would absolutely second what Dustin just said, is that, when regulation comes, and they're coming, our side of the industry, the processing side, is going to be their major focus, in my opinion. They're not going to come after the farmers. That's just really bad optics. But the processing part is the linchpin of all the products that we see and hear about. One of the things that's really changed since the Farm Bill is, I think the Farm Bill is a tremendous thing that happened. It's due to advocacy. Politicians didn't one day wake up and say, hey, I think hemp is a great idea for our country, our community, or our people. That's not what happened. Due to advocacy is the reason why we are today. But actually, I think, moreover, it's almost one of the best classic Kansas City shuffles, because 5 months prior to that is really what I pay attention to, and that is the rescheduling of CBD, putting it directly in the wheelhouse for everything oral and topical that the FDA controls. So for me, that's the biggest change. The regulation that's coming and preparing for the regulations. We've put absolutely a countless amount of personnel hours into trying to become compliant and trying to get ready for the regulation. So that's the biggest things that's changed for me.
Excellent, excellent. How about you?
I would
Fine, sir.
The big thing that I've seen regulation or the FDA's involvement, the Farm Bill bring, is an issue we face across the industry, which is outside investment. I think you're going to see a lot of people that are firing up 10,000, 20. I'm hearing crazy numbers from some extractors that have never extracted a thing in their life. To all you guys out there growing hemp, you spent all season growing it. Do not rush to get it extracted. This will be yet another year where we're going to hear that there's been too much hemp grown. You're going to see the market just peak and valley. But make sure you know your extractor. Spend the time. Do that now. If you know you're actively going to be looking for an extractor, avoid a broker. I don't know about you guys, but I know I have no problem talking to the guy that has 5 acres, 500 acres, or 5,000 acres. Call the extractor up directly. Work with them. But definitely use caution this season. I am hearing and seeing some things that, from a guy who's worked in the extraction side for over a decade now, things that are completely impossible, promises being made, and the first person that takes the biggest hurt is the farmer. It's been that way, so just know your extractor.
For sure. So I'd like to ask you, what have you seen happen to pricing over the last 24 months? So the last 2 years for, let's say, a kilogram of isolate, a kilogram of crude, and a kilogram of distillate. Give me your high and your low that you've seen.
Oh gosh, on the crude market, that's an easy one. I've seen crude go from as low, and I guess I'd be talking to standardize it, say a 3% THC, 50% plus CBD. I've seen it go from 700 all the way up to, at one time, I had people making large scale purchases at 15 and 1600 a kilo. The isolate industry is one that I guess I hear of, but it's not really my extraction background. I think that crude's probably going to be where the market is set, simply because it's the first tradable commodity. It's the first standardization from a group of 1,000 farmers, batches of crude you can you can analyze analytically, and categorize and sell fairly easily.
Yeah, for sure. Bill, how about you?
Yeah, I've seen similar prices for sure. You know, one interesting thing is that you know, I've seen isolate prices as of late. I've heard some prices even as yesterday under $3,000. Whether that's real or not, I don't know, but it's certainly out there. You know, the prices as far as, you know, like tea-free distillate, you know, a year ago you could probably get 10 to 12,000 reasonably. Now you're between 6 and 8, and that's just because right now there is a lot. There is a substantial amount of oil on the market now, but not a lot of processing ability. But the prices, I think, they're going to be relatively low for a little while. But what's going to happen is through regulation, you know, there's going to be fewer and fewer processors able to stay at a level that they're going to be allowed to remain open. So I believe that the pinch point for processing is only going to increase, especially once regulation kicks in. So those prices, I think, are going to pick back up because there's not going to be the availability on the market that there is now.
Definitely. Dustin, how about yourself, bud?
I'd probably agree with Bill on that. Is that right now it's extremely low. I can imagine there's people selling a lot of their isolate and crude oil for probably almost a loss or a break even. I'm assuming just because. With the regulations coming, there's probably a decent amount of processors see the writing on the wall that they may not be around too much longer. So liquidating whatever asset they have may be what they're trying to strategize for. And as some of the processors go away and stuff start you know, maybe places start merging and there's a consolidation, the price will probably go back up. There could be a spike, and then maybe somewhere, you know, not long after that, it'll start leveling out. And it's also important to look at the things, the isolate and the crude oil and the THC-free oil, and not looking at it as so much as that's the finished product. You got to start looking at it as, you know, maybe a gram of that is an average product, one product on the market. And so instead of looking as a thing that you're selling, you need to start looking at the finished product selling, so that when you hear these claims of these facilities doing 10, 20,000 pounds a day, that's great. Is there equipment out there to do it? Absolutely. Can it be done? Absolutely. But is it necessary? No, not when you start looking at finished product. Because whoever's buying the crude oil and isolate has to turn it into consumer product. So you got to start evaluating things that way a little bit, more than just, okay, I've got 100 kilos of crude oil, how much will you sell it to me for?
Good points, definitely. So often people who aren't in the processing world, they don't really understand what goes on there exactly. And one of the most important and popular questions is often, how much does it take to make a kilogram? How much hemp do you need to make a kilogram of, and you fill in the blank?
Well, I can tackle that very simply. It's hard to say just sitting here because I don't know exactly what any farmer or any customer is going to bring me. So it's really based on the percentage of the material in, good out.
Let's say an average. Whoa, hey, sorry. Let's say an average of 10%, 10 points. How many pounds would you need to process out to get to a kilogram of, say, isolate? How much hemp?
To a kilo of isolate, probably about 12 pounds, probably 12, 13 pounds-ish.
Yeah, this is a question I'm glad you touched on, because as an extractor, I'm not sure who came up with the how many pounds of flour to make a kilo of isolate conversion.
Because they're not.
It is a question that makes sense to no extractor on earth, because it is such an open-ended question. I had a guy bring me a batch of pelletized hemp. I extracted it. I think I made a kilo of sugar per every 14 pounds extracted. I never thought that I would be extracting sugar, and I thought I had crushed it and made this crude oil that went crystalline in 2 days and was a solid bucket. After laboratory analysis, it was sugar. So I don't know that's a metric that I really avoid, and people call me all the time and say, well, how many pounds of my flour to make a kilo of isolate? And
Exactly.
it's so open. How did you process it? How did you harvest it? How did you store it? It's a really hard one, and that's a slippery slope that I back off of and say, no,
Okay. So I think some.
Yeah,
Okay. So some people might think that that's an education point, but when you get that question all the time, it can, I'm sure, get a bit annoying. So what do you recommend to people who are trying to figure that out if they're farming and they need to do something with their crop? That's a really important question to have an answer to. Dustin, what do you think?
I think evaluating that is very difficult because one, the value of that crop isn't just in how many kilos of crude or isolate you get. It's going to be more how many milligrams per pound of flour. That's a hard number to think of, but the reason is because I could go and say I don't get a real great return in someone's eyes on the extraction, but maybe the potency's fairly high in the crude oil. So if I have a oil that's 50% and I had yields, and usually they correlate, but the important message is you can't just evaluate how many pounds to kilo. You got to evaluate how many milligrams of CBD you ended up with, because once again, back to the consumer product thing, is we're selling the products based on a milligram. We've got a bottle that's got 750 milligrams. That's how we evaluate it. There's probably a place to evaluate the value of a crop in the same manner.
to touch on what Dustin's saying there, as an extractor, I'm actually happy to finally start working with customers who the pricing is finally somewhat normalizing or standardizing, where no longer do people call me up and ask me how much for a kilo of crude oil. My price structure is now going to price per milligram, regardless of percentage on the crude oil that they're working with. And I think a lot of that comes from the scale of industry that is coming towards us all.
Excellent, thank you. So next question. Wanted to find out if you guys could share with everyone here why you chose processing, extracting, among all the other opportunities you have in hemp. Why did you go this route?
Well, I kind of came into it, my background is in physics. Before I was doing this processing directly, I was a deep sea construction diver. It just kind of made a little bit of sense to me. And one day on a napkin in Florida, we drew out that mobile extraction lab that I talked of earlier. So that's how I kind of came into it. But myself and my family have been involved in purveying cannabinoids for a long time. So,
Are there other areas within the hemp industry that you're involved in beyond?
yeah, I'm currently part of a farming group, just Longmont, Hygiene, Pierce. We have about 1,500 acres that we're growing this year. So I'm a busy guy.
Excellent. How about yourself?
I came to the industry through the marijuana side of things. I actually still own a marijuana extraction facility in Denver. It was partially an economic decision. Once hemp came on, if you were willing to work in kind of the darker shade of gray that it was 4 and 5 years ago, there was a lot of money to be made. And I had already run an extraction facility for a number of years. So I just simply looked at finally I wasn't going to be limited by plant count. I wasn't going to have the beast that has become the MED just right over top of me all the time. I was going to be finally able to get 10, 20, 50,000 pounds of plant material and really figure out how to dial in a CO2 extraction machine. The first CO2 extraction machine I ran was a completely manually operated, minimal PRVs, blowing open tanks, heating things up with hot water and cold water and forcing it through. And I welcomed being able to come into an industry that I could see was going to ramp up quickly.
Thank you. Dustin?
My story is pretty simple. Got into started growing hemp for CBD and had to figure out a way to make money with it. And so I just learned how to extract really fast.
Got it. Okay, do we have any questions for anybody on extractions or processing? All right, so each of you can answer that. I think you're in the $35 to $55 range, unless you do a pre-purchase agreement, is what I've seen. What are you saying? You're very surprised.
What's the question?
What's your question about total?
Price per pound for flour.
For tolling?
Oh, pardon me.
I can answer that. I mean, generally, depends on the weight, depends on the contract, but we're seeing pricing anywhere from $13 to $17 a pound, reasonably.
I would agree with that. On the CO2 side, sometimes you have a customer that wants you to target, maybe to run something a little bit different. You can get a little bit surplus, but I would agree with that. 13 on the low end. If you've got 300 pounds and you want me to run it, $20. But I think you're going to see some things change this year. I'm sure it's affected my fellows up here on the stage, but pesticides. Somebody out here growing is going to grow a crop that's going to be tainted with pesticides. And that's something that I'm working towards doing, is being able to remediate pesticides so that a farmer doesn't lose his entire crop. With that comes an expensive extraction process. It requires me to clean out and to do a lot of different things. But I would say, 13 to $20 a pound on the simple side.
Yeah, I would say an average of about $15 a pound on toll processing. This last year, if it was a small contract, then it was as high as 25. But I'm sure it'll get a lot lower, and that definitely gets lower when you get into volumes. And ideally, you want volumes in, because once you get going, you just want to keep running.
So, any other questions? How about orange shirt there? First. How do the profits of CO2 compare to ethanol? Oh, the overhead costs. Yeah.
So, your machines, your solvents, labor, that sort of thing.
I think that's one that's going to change quickly here. The reason you saw so many people running towards ethanol was there is a cheaper cost of entry there. They failed to calculate one of the big things that's coming, which has been spoke about earlier, which is the storage of 10,000 gallons of ethanol. Your typical gas station probably doesn't store as much flammable liquids as some of these really large scale ethanol plants do. And so I think you're going to see ethanol get a lot more expensive. CO2, when done properly, really, it's got an expensive initial cost of purchasing the equipment, but its overhead isn't outrageously more than ethanol.
You guys have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say that, it's similar statement is that, the entry point for a higher end CO2 supercritical machine can be prohibitive. But similarly, on the other side, ethanol, those processing equipment, you can find them for reasonably priced, but again, absolutely the storage of that much ethanol, I mentioned all these different rooms and seat configurations, it gets quite costly. And also with ethanol, there's some talk of being able to reproof your ethanol, but that's not the case yet. So you have a tremendous waste stream with that as well. So that would be something to consider.
Dustin?
Yeah, storage is one of the biggest negatives to ethanol and the regulatory and the fire code and all those things. And and then it limits you also to where you can even put this. If you're storing enough alcohol, you have to actually be a hazmat level facility, and they don't take much. A lot of
Do you
these.
find that more expensive or less expensive, ethanol versus CO2?
I think in the long term, ethanol is more expensive, and in the short term, CO2 is more expensive. Well, if you were just looking at it on a very fundamental basis, there's a lot of things to evaluate, because it depends on the CO2. If someone's running CO2 and they still have to winterize, there's other steps that might be going into it to have a finished product. So that could add a lot of cost, but recovering alcohol all the way is pretty tough too. And if you keep, and once again, reproofing it, if you keep reusing that alcohol and it gets enough moisture in there, well, it's going to start losing its solubility, and so your cost starts coming in efficiencies too. So there's so many things to evaluate there.
Excellent. You had a question? Speak up. Equipment engineers, okay. So what equipment needs are not being met now that you see would need to be met or should be? So what equipment opportunities are there?
I think the biggest problem with especially stateside equipment is the time it takes to get it and construct it. We purchased our equipment in China. Not only the availability, you sacrifice some parts of quality, translation, forget about tech support, you're figuring it out yourself. But that would be the biggest problem I would see with stateside is getting great equipment in less than 18 months.
How about yourself?
I would say shooting from the cuff, probably large scale efficient winterization. No
Definitely.
one, I have spent a lot of money and a lot of time and I've gotten pretty good at it, but I've made it all on my own. If you're looking to make money, figure out how to winterize, 5,000 gallons of ethanol a day with a constant throughput and not having me have filters that cost $400 and $500 a day.
Excellent question, Bill.
Yeah, I was just going to say here. That winterization process, in my plant, our throughput through our production side is impossible to keep up with it. So we're actually farming out work. So we can't keep up with it. Yeah.
Yeah, winterization I guess is a big part, but maybe there's solutions in the extraction on that, as on how cold you extract, possibly on that. I don't think our biggest problem in the industry is in extraction, it's drying. So if you want to solve something, solve drying, please.
Definitely. Time for one last question. Christian, you had a question.
Well, I'll kind of harken back to exactly what my esteemed colleague said here. It's very difficult to say exactly that. Again, both incredibly effective solvents in their own right. Some tear more from the plant than others, and that's really what I could say. It's really more about a profile in your crude to start with. I think would be the best way to answer that without giving you, a percentage result.
Excellent.
It's hard to tell. I mean, it's just not that simple to evaluate it and yield, because obviously if one or the two are better in too many ways, then everyone would just be running that and there wouldn't be two different ways. It's as simple as that.
Got it. Thank you. So I want to end this panel with this question, because 3 years ago, when I was up here moderating a panel, I asked this question, and I'm wondering how this has changed. Okay, how many people in the room currently make 100% of their income from hemp? Let's count them. Okay, one. Okay, so me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. We probably have about 100 people here. So about 12% currently. It was less than 1% 3 years ago. That's pretty good. Yeah, round of applause. Definitely. Okay, so the one thing that you can do is incorporate hemp into your everyday life. So we want to encourage you to do that, and everybody have a good event. Thank you.
And I want to just say one more thing, y'all. I want to harken on something. Don't rush into finding a processor for your material. Trust, but verify. If they're not willing to show you what they're telling you, walk away.
I'd like to add to that, guys, if you grew 5,000 pounds of hemp and you're taking your material to someone who tells you they do 20,000 pound batches, be very careful. I worked with a number of people this year. My whole reason for wanting to do pesticide remediation is I saw a number of farmers this year send their product off to somebody that had big fancy advertising and looked really good, and their 5,000 or 8,000 pounds got batched in with 6 other people's stuff, and now everybody's product tested positive for pesticides that they had no control over. I watched guys lose their entire crop simply for a few percentage points, $1 or $2 per pound. Know your extractor and know them well. Be comfortable conversating with them.
And absolutely know that they actually do, that they have SOPs between clients, they have SOPs between lots of cleaning to avoid that type of cross-contamination. You know, that's super, super important. The integrity of your product should mean as much to your processor as it does to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you everybody for being here. Hey, Morris, if you want to come back up, we're wrapped on this panel. Any last questions while Morris is on the way? I know there's one itching question out there. All right. Well, everybody enjoy your time.